Hey guys, I'm here to talk to you guys about headless CMSs, headless e-commerce, and headless architecture today, and try to demystify the confusion that I see pretty frequently around adopting this type of architecture. So now the question is, why use a CMS at all? If these open source CMSs, made you responsible for so many things, why did people do this in the first place at all? Well, firstly, we had a very different internet back then than we do now. Things were more traditionally hosted. You were used to having a virtual server. Things started gradually migrating to a cloud environment, and now we look at serverless, or this edge compute and content distribution networks all over the world. And these more traditional CMSs gave you a ton of power. They allowed you to build blogs really quickly. They allowed you to stand up e-commerce stores really quickly. They've got 20 years of hardened experience dealing with the exact problems of content management and product management that you don't want to have to reinvent over and over again. So these are great, but they have started to show their age in recent years because they don't run in these faster, edge-ready environments that we're starting to see people gravitate towards. Especially when we talk about e-commerce, the idea that every second counts is important. Every second that it takes for the page to load, you're losing visitors. Everybody's been there before. You fire up Instagram, you click the shop link, and that loading bar just goes, and you're waiting, and you're waiting, and you're wondering what's going on, and nothing's loading. Well, we have a lot of technology now that has enabled things to load way faster than we're used to and be more available to more users in areas of low connectivity. Maybe you're in the subway or on a train, or you're even in a department store or a mall trying to check the price on something. This is where the traditional CMS, this traditional model that we're talking about, is starting to show its age and starting to fall apart. And we've seen that companies even like Google are starting to rank you against the speed of other stores in your category and other sites in your category. And now it's become mission critical to figure out, how do we increase the speed of these websites? And that's where headless architecture starts to fit in here. So we've explained how moving towards headless starts to give you a flexibility that we didn't have previously. We had more rigid CMS systems. So you have something like WordPress, like Drupal, like Magento, very specialized use case. These are open source. You are more than welcome to crack the hood and start hacking away at them and changing the fundamental nature of those CMSs. It was not a good recommendation to do something like that, because with great flexibility comes great complexity. And when we start to modify those systems, we create more flexible versions of them, but a lot of times we spend more time fighting the CMS than we did actually enabling the business logic that needed to be done. So WordPress, again, has enabled a bunch of really cool things that have made it very flexible. So things like custom post types and different fields. And Shopify even has added, and that's not a traditional CMS, but they've even added things like meta fields to try and give you a little more flexibility without having to actually dig into the core code and rip it apart and make those kind of changes that would start to diminish the benefits of having a large open source development team that put time into hardening that code, right? So once you start ripping apart the core, you're losing the benefits. Now, when we move to headless, we have a lot of flexibility now, right? These are CMSs that have really great UIs. They have really great ways for us to manipulate content. We can build anything on top of them using the tools of a flexible content model, as well as the idea of webhooks or events that can be fired out of these CMSs. We can also create plugins that can be baked into these CMSs. But I need to caution you here, because a lot of times what you want is to use the CMS in conjunction with something a little more traditional. For example, a Contentful with Shopify is a great combo because you get the benefits of Shopify's experience in e-commerce. As then you can start layering in the flexibility you want with Contentful, and we'll show you how this works here in just a moment. But you have to be careful, because it's sort of like renting a home versus buying a home. Buying a home is saving you money if you don't keep putting money into it. There's always this idea, right? When you rent, you throw money away on rent. But what they don't account for is your dreams are diminished when you're renting. You can't just rip up the kitchen and redo it. You're not tempted to throw a new roof on or re-landscape the backyard. You're not allowed to. And the same thing happens with Shopify. Your costs can remain low because you're not allowed to do certain things. Once you move to headless, you have a lot of flexibility. It's like owning. It becomes more custom, but with the benefits of not having to deal with the DevOps, which is really important, and we'll talk a bunch more about that. But the key thing here is you have to always play that game in your head. You have to say, is the juice worth the squeeze here? Yes, I can do this, but should I do this? What's the cost of maintaining that over time? Is this well tested enough? You need a higher caliber of developer that's going to write tests for you, that's going to make sure that everything is tested. And that doesn't mean everybody QAs it manually. This is unit tests, this is integration testing, this is test-driven development. These are things that traditional agencies do not practice when they're building WordPress websites. They do not practice when they're building Shopify websites. But it's very important that these features get tested as integrations together, that you spend the time to harden the feature set yourself. So it's always worth saying, I get a lot of flexibility out of this. I can do more because there's less rigidity in the system, but it also comes at the price of there's more complexity to the system. You require a technical resource to understand that, or at least document it for you, and you may not necessarily need the same tech person all the time, but the person who manages the CMS needs to be slightly more technical and have a little bit more of an understanding of how all the pieces fit together, or you're going to find yourself really frustrated. I think the first step to demystifying this, though, is we have to talk a little bit about how your existing CMS works and how the web works in general, because I do note that we hear a lot of things like, can my CMS do X, or can it do Y? And it's inherently a little bit of a misnomer to speak in that way, because the CMS doesn't really do anything that we don't enable it to do. So we really try to say that headless enables flexibility that the previous CMSs didn't. So if we take a look at my canvas here, so let's start by talking about how the traditional CMS worked for the last 20 years, let's say. Many of you are used to having your usual CMS, and this could be something like WordPress, this could be Drupal, this could be Shopify, this could be Magento, this could be BigCommerce. Any of your classical CMSs that you're used to using worked in this way. There's a server. This represents your server right here. And this server puts data together with HTML templates to serve to your users. So let's just kind of take a look at what's going on here. Let's envision this is your user's computer right here. So this is your user client. We also often call this the client, or the front end, maybe you've heard. Those terms, maybe you've been confused by that. This is your where your templates get served, and those get served to your users, and we'll draw ourselves a little user here so we don't remember. This is your user and their computer or browser. The server is taking data. This might be your product catalog. This might be blog post data. This is going to be category data. This could even be user data when users log in and out. And it's going to add that with your template, HTML, and it's effectively going to push these two things together. And the way to think about it, if you've never programmed in these types of templates before, if you come from a non-technical background, is the template is almost like Mad Libs, and the data fills in the blanks in the HTML document that goes to the browser, and the browser is able to display that in conjunction with CSS or style sheets in the desired design. And your backend CMS or server is handling all of that for you. And you, as the administrator, are hanging out on the other side of this with your browser, right? So you also have a client. So let's just take these two boxes here and bring them over here. You also have a client. That client is, again, your computer, your browser. And that interface, that UI, and let's just call this the admin, the administrator here, you are making changes to the CMS, and every time the user comes to the CMS, data gets combined with the template, and that template gets served up to the user. And this is exactly how CMSs have traditionally worked. They give the administrator control over the data, the ability to input data. There's also a database sitting underneath this. So let's just talk about that for just a second here. You have a traditional database, and I'll just make a little, this is a little database icon that we're going to make right here. So this is the database for your CMS. You are also
in most cases, so if you're in the WordPress, the Drupal, or the Magento world, you are also responsible for this database. You need to make sure that you back it up. You need to make sure that it's always available. You also need to make sure that it has enough memory to store all the data that you want. The CMS gives you the ability to usually control these types of things, makes it a little bit easier, but you are responsible for the server and the database when we're looking at open source. So let's just talk about these CMSs here, because we have two classes of CMSs here. We have, let's make this a little bit larger, we have the open source world. And in this world, you are, I just want to align to the left here, right? You are responsible for all the DevOps, right? You're responsible for things like hosting. You're responsible for DB backups. You're responsible for DB size and provisioning resources. You're generally going to hire a dev shop, or you're going to have a developer that makes sure all of this stuff is operational. And the CMSs that fall into this camp are, so let's just talk about the CMSs here. They are classically WordPress, Drupal. Magento also falls into this, even though they do also have an option that is hosted through Adobe now. They can be self-hosted. There's a number of others, but these are just the most popular when we talk about the open source world. So the key thing to open source that you remember here is that you're responsible for your server and your database and maintaining that those environments are up to date at all times. On the other side of here, we have your more SaaS models. And in these, you have managed services, right? So hosting taken care of, database taken care of. Right? This is all going to be managed. The CMSs that fall into this are going to be things like Shopify, BigCommerce. Who are the other, you can have Magento in this camp if you're working within the Adobe system. But then on the these are, if you notice, these are more e-commerce CMSs. E-commerce was a little bit quicker to this game of the SaaS managed CMS. On the other side of it, we start to get into Headless. And Headless is also managed, but the configuration is slightly different. It becomes more flexible. There's not as many things done for you. So these original services, Shopify, BigCommerce, Magento, their big thing that they do for you is they're set up to handle all of your general kind of abstractions and models. There's the concept of products and variants and coupons and order checkout, pricing, taxes. It does a lot, and it's very specialized to the e-com use case. Most people find themselves increasingly gravitating towards the SaaS camp because as your business grows, there's just a lot more responsibility to handling these other CMSs. A lot of people still use WordPress for things like their blog and their content, but as we start talking about the mission-critical e-commerce infrastructure, we've seen a big rise in people working on the SaaS side. I think another one back in, they're not as popular anymore, but it was Demandware was in this camp where it was, again, SaaS model. You pay them, they provision all the resources. You may have to pay for different sizes, but they're going to auto scale for you. So that's another key piece here is you don't have to worry too much about the scale. It's going to auto scale for you. You may have to pay a higher price as you scale, but this is all going to be managed for you. Today, I'd like to talk a little bit less about the open source side of things, because I do think that this is a bigger responsibility and it's not seeing as much popularity as the SaaS side of things when we talk about e-commerce.
You've heard of the Headless CMS before. Well, something's happened in recent years in that all of these traditional CMSs can be done in a headless manner. You can use WordPress as a headless CMS. You can use Drupal as a headless CMS. You don't have to use the HTML component. In fact, if you've taken a look at Shopify and BigCommerce, they've invested heavily in their headless infrastructure. So your first step on the road to headless is using one CMS in a headless configuration with one of these new frameworks like Next.js. That's your first step. Why would you do this? That's a pure performance play. You're going to get a lot of performance out of using one of these more performant frameworks, as well as getting a better front-end framework for doing the types of UI and UX things that users are becoming accustomed to on the internet. What you won't get from that is a ton of flexibility in the functionality. So we build Headless directly on top of Shopify, and you build your pages in Shopify, you build your products in Shopify, and you do your blogging and all that stuff, and or you do it in WordPress with WooCommerce, and that data comes over to this new server you've stood up, this new framework you've stood up, and it builds the pages, and everything is pretty good that way. That gets you part of the way there. What are you missing then? Well, when you want to augment that data, when we want to say expand the product model, the resources available to you can be quite limited in the traditional CMS. Again, things like Shopify, BigCommerce have come a long way. They've added things like meta fields, but the act of seeing them and using them in their CMS is not as nice or as clean or as configurable as something like Contentful or Content Stack that has been built from the ground up to be flexible and to build a UX to your CMS that might be better for different users. For instance, we have really technical users that want really unbounded control, and we can enable that through Contentful. We also have non-technical users that really need the guardrails put on, and those guardrails exist to keep them from doing things that would otherwise break their site. We can do that with Contentful. We can actually manipulate this so that the UX is a little better for them in management. These are some nice things. The other nice thing about the newer headless CMSs is they have better content distribution networks for things like rich media, being able to convert images to WebP by just adding a single URL parameter to the end, or resize them dynamically using a single URL parameter. Services that used to do this were things like Scene 7, or you'd use like a Scene 7 or Cloudinary can do this. You'd have to plug something else into your WordPress. I think Shopify right now, they just do like a set of can sizes, but they can't really handle that flexibility, and it doesn't do the WebP conversion. And if you've been in Lighthouse, that's the #1 thing that comes up the first time you start loading images, right? You need to serve images in next-gen formats. This is something that Contentful helps you with because it allows everybody, all your designers can still work in JPEG and PNG, and then Contentful will do that conversion for you into WebP, which is really nice and convenient. You can also do quality compression of those images. As imagery grows and becomes more important on websites, this is a huge advantage to combining Contentful with something like Shopify, with something like WordPress, where you don't necessarily need to manage Fastly CDN, bunch of NoSQL databases and caches, publication flows. That stuff's all taken care of for you. So we start to want to marry these two things together so that we can get the best of both worlds. We can leverage all the years of e-commerce experience that something like Shopify has put together, but we can also get the performance, the flexibility, and the usability of a system like Contentful. But once again, with great flexibility comes great complexity. The more modifications you try and push in between those systems, between the system and your front end, the more you're going to have to maintain, the more you're going to have to know about. So it's important to still make sure that you're being advised in a way that keeps the balance proper for you and your team and the resources you have available to you. When we have clients with a lot of engineering resources, we can do a lot. When we have clients with not a lot of engineering resources, we try and limit the customization there to keep it easier on you so that there's less that can go wrong. And once again, when things go wrong and you don't understand what's going wrong, that's where the frustration comes from.
So now the question is, why use a CMS at all? If these open source CMSs, made you responsible for so many things, why did people do this in the first place at all? Well, firstly, we had a very different internet back then than we do now. Things were more traditionally hosted. You were used to having a virtual server. Things started gradually migrating to a cloud environment, and now we look at serverless or this edge compute and content distribution networks all over the world. And these more traditional CMSs gave you a ton of power. They allowed you to build blogs really quickly. They allowed you to stand up e-commerce stores really quickly. They've got 20 years of hardened experience dealing with the exact problems of content management and product management that you don't want to have to reinvent over and over again. So these are great, but they have started to show their age in recent years because they don't run in these faster, edge-ready environments that we're starting to see people gravitate towards. Especially when we talk about e-commerce, the idea that every second counts is important. Every second that it takes for the page to load, you're losing visitors. Everybody's been there before. You fire up Instagram, you click the shop link, and that loading bar just goes, and you're waiting, and you're waiting, and you're wondering what's going on, and nothing's loading. Well, we have a lot of technology now that has enabled things to load way faster than we're used to and be more available to more users in areas of low connectivity. Maybe you're in the subway or on a train, or you're even in a department store or a mall trying to check the price on something. This is where the traditional CMS, this traditional model that we're talking about, is starting to show its age and starting to fall apart. And we've seen that companies even like Google are starting to rank you against the speed of other stores in your category and other sites in your category. And now it's become mission critical to figure out, how do we increase the speed of these websites? And that's where headless architecture starts to fit in here.
And so when we talk about new front-end frameworks, we have things like Next.js, Remix, Nuxt, SvelteKit. These are newer frameworks in that they use they use better front-end frameworks that we have now, like React, like Vue, like Svelte, but they also can provide API endpoints as serverless functions. So it enables us to have a back-end and a front-end that sits in front of your CMS now. So that's effectively what we mean by headless. The CMS itself is serving JSON to these other frameworks, these other servers that we have stood up that do things like pre-compile these pages and distribute the images as well as the HTML on powerful CDN systems and serverless systems. At the edge now, increasingly, is becoming more popular. It's going to just keep getting faster. Some people might even call this a back-end for front-end kind of system, where there's a back-end that compiles the data, all these different sources from Shopify, from Contentful, from WordPress even, brings them together into these HTML pages that are statically rendered.
So now we understand the traditional environment. We've talked about the pitfalls of getting into more flexibility. Now let's just talk about exactly how your headless configuration is different and how it ends up making things more flexible for you and faster for your users. So in the traditional environment, you have this server and DB. This is actually exactly what your headless CMS is going to have also. They're going to have a server and a database. The difference is it's going to be in this SaaS model, right? So we can actually add here Contentful. These are just CMSs. The difference between something like Contentful, and let's add Sanity is one of them. Let's add Prismic. You know, there's a lot of them out there. Everybody's using a different one. There's Content Stack, right? We've worked with a ton of them over the years. The difference is, in this configuration, let's remove the user here. This is serving HTML to your user in the traditional use case. Data plus template, that Mad Lib style that we talked about, serves HTML over to your user and it shows up in the browser. The headless CMS is going to be kind of similar to this. Let's just duplicate this and put it alongside it so we can see it. Let's move some things around here. And move this, and we'll take this. This is serving JSON. And JSON, what is JSON? It's data without the template. For all intensive purposes, if you're technical and yelling at me about that, listen, this video might not be for you. This is a non-technical video. For all intensive purposes, your headless CMS outputs the data layer. You are now responsible for the template layer. So you have JSON coming out of here. That gets combined with a different server, which is going to be your UI server. This is going to be your framework. This is, for us, this is usually Next.js. This is going to be things like SvelteKit. This is going to be Nuxt. So let's add some of these here. This is going to be something like Next.js. This is going to be Shopify. You just saw about Remix. This is going to be Remix. This is going to be Nuxt, which is Vue-based. This will be SvelteKit. They were front-end frameworks, but these servers do truly handle more. They handle that. You can have server endpoints, and you can serve your front end through this. So the JSON is going to come into your UI server, and out the other end, we're going to get our HTML and JavaScript and everything else.
The idea behind Jamstack was that we were going to statically render these pages, all the pages of your website, at build time in advance, instead of doing it dynamically when the user requested it. So in the traditional WordPress world, in the Drupal world, in the traditional CMS world, Shopify even, your data and your template come together, and then that's served to the user. The server does that work every single time a user visits your website. In the Jamstack world, that's done when you make a change to the CMS. It's stored on a CDN, and that page doesn't have to be recomputed. So it feels very, very fast to your user.
Is that we're getting this JSON, it hits our UI server. Our UI server goes in there and it turns this into pages, but there's a little something different that makes this fast and really fast for your users that you're not used to with this traditional server environment. And the key here is every single time a person makes a request into the traditional server here, the data in the HTML is smashed together and served back to the user. If you can imagine, it takes time to put the data in HTML together and serve it back to your user. When we start talking about using these newer UI frameworks, we can do things called statically render, which means I can create the HTML for all of your pages at build time. So when you make a change to the CMS, let's bring this admin back over here so we can kind of explain this. You're making a change to the CMS that sends a signal. These CMSs can send signals. They send a signal to our UI server, and our UI server builds all the pages and stores them on a CDN. So let's just imagine lots and lots of pages, right? Your whole product catalog here on a content distribution network. This is globally distributed, statically rendered pages. And then these pages, when a user logs in and requests them, boom, that's what they get. And you can imagine this is many orders of magnitude faster for the user this way than the old way, because we're not making the user await this compute time. You've seen this before. We've talked about it before. You log into Instagram, you get that white screen or that black screen, and you're just like, is there a website coming? Is something happening? The loading bar's sort of there. As opposed to in this world where the HTML is on demand, ready, already computed and compiled from the last time an admin made a change, and it comes right to the user. In addition to that, a lot of these frameworks do additional optimizations. For instance, when I hover my mouse over the next link, it fetches the next page from the CDN in the background. So as soon as I click on it, it's there. In mobile, as soon as I press, if you imagine when you press, a click in mobile is a press down and a press up. But what these frameworks are doing is on press down, it's loading the next page. As soon as you lift your thumb, it's already started. It's already, ideally, it's fully done loading the next page, and it's almost instant. This is a major gain, and it can't be understated in e-commerce systems because people don't like to wait. And once you've shopped on a site with a 100 Lighthouse score that is doing these techniques, you'll never go back to the old way again. You will lose your tolerance for this world.
So now I want to talk a little bit about the stages of headless e-commerce, because when it comes to building a blog, it's fairly straightforward. You're going to use a headless CMS, and we build the code on top of that. And maybe you're going to use a headless WordPress, which is becoming increasingly popular as well. But when it comes to e-commerce, you have a lot more complexity going on, and speed is extremely important. So that's where we start saying, hey, our product pages need to be blended with this rich content, and we're going to use something like Contentful because it's better for imagery, for video, for authoring content, for augmenting the content around some of your products. If you want to do things like how-to videos, if you want to add influencer videos, things of that nature, it starts to become better to manage your content or the content infrastructure around that through something like Contentful. And we tend to build the entire product catalog as a combination of an interplay between Contentful and Shopify or BigCommerce, or Commerce Tools is another one, right? On the other side of that, checkout becomes a little bit of an exception here. So the next stage is to do headless commerce with the integrated checkout from something like Shopify, which means you're going to bounce the user to a subdomain when they check out, and after they're done checking out, they'll be redirected back to the main site. So if you had mysite.com, this would be checkout.mysite.com. Why might we want to do this? Well, we talk about the complexity and the flexibility. Ultimate flexibility is complete and total headless system where you own everything from your home page through your category pages, through your product page, right down to your checkout, and we build all of that custom. However, you have to be prepared to own your own checkout, because now we're talking about very mission critical infrastructure for the e-commerce experience being managed by you. This means that when the payment processor isn't working, someone has to wake up in the middle of the night to fix it. And do you have that someone? Ideally, you don't have someone. You have many people that run a rotation. Shopify has that for you, right? So in general, we recommend that users who want to get into headless, who need customization, to try to stay within the limits of using a very custom front end, main part of your site, but keep the checkout hosted with Shopify or BigCommerce, because they have things like Apple Pay built in, Android Pay built in, Affirm, and of course the credit card processor hookups that you're used to, taxes, shipping, plugs into all your other systems. That checkout, though, is not as modifiable. So when you want to do very specific things, you're going to run into some of the limitations that you've run into with Shopify before. However, we do have a little bit more flexibility. We have control over the cart in the front end that the user sees. So we can do something like when a user hits a specific threshold, show them a free product, or we've done things with a mystery product or something of that nature that shows up in cart, the user checks out. That all has to be integrated into Shopify, right? So they're going to check out with the free product. We can apply the coupon code using a URL parameter when the user clicks over. And then we do have the opportunity to modify the order on the other side after it's placed. So your Shopify checkout happens, and then you can do something. For example, the best example we've had is the mystery product that needs to be swapped with a specific product for the warehouse to pick it up. That gets done. Shopify lets our system know, hey, an order just happened. Our webhook or our API endpoint that's hosted with our front-end framework picks that up and says, hey, this person qualifies for the discount. They have the mystery product. Let's swap it for the thing that we wanted. And we make that modification happen on the back end. You need to be prepared, though, to set that up. You need to test it. Be very aware. You are modifying order data after it's been paid for. You want to be very sure that that's well tested before you start opening that up to the world. And these things can be tricky to test because test environments with Shopify are not the greatest. So again, be experienced. Make sure you leave yourself enough time to make things like that happen. And at the same time, really consider, is that exactly what I want to do? So you're going to find the limitations of your e-commerce platform start to surface again, specifically at the checkout layer. And mainly not because you can build a custom checkout, but you really need to have the team ready for it. You really need to have somebody who is going to run that support, because if you call Shopify with your custom checkout and say that this is not working, they're going to say, well, this is not our code. Yeah, from our perspective, the payment process is working. Everything's set up. Everything's well tested on our end. There might be something going on in that checkout flow. The interplay between your plugins. Now you really can't install any type of plugin you want in Shopify. You need to start thinking about what you're installing in Shopify, because not all of it's going to work and not all of it's going to be ready. Your front end code at the checkout level and at the product level is not going to be ready to receive it. So you want to be prepared for that when you do. So our base configuration that we recommend is stick with that checkout as long as you possibly can, because you don't want to have to own that piece. You really want to stick with owning that front end, manipulate the cart, virtualize it for your users. You can create all sorts of really great user experiences in the cart, and then when they come over to the checkout, it follows the more traditional scheme.
So I fired up a empty Contentful instance here. I chose Contentful because we're very familiar with it here. It's one of the first headless CMSs I ever used, and so I want to show people what this looks like at the inception, because I think a lot of clients don't get to see what can Contentful do out of the box. Well, you're looking at it. Nothing. There's nothing here. I go to my content model. Empty. This is completely empty. If you're used to WordPress, you're used to seeing posts, or if you're in Shopify, products, pages, product variants, coupons, discounts, settings. There's all sorts of stuff that's already done for you. Contentful starts you off clean, and you can begin to model your data in a way that makes sense for you and your business. So I'm just going to start with the idea of, I want to make a blog post, and I want that blog post to have a few fields and some authors, right? So let's design a content model, because this is the first step to using a CMS, is modeling the data, and this is the part that usually your development team is doing for you. So I'm going to create a new content type, and I'm just going to call it a blog post. And you can add a description. You don't have to. API identifier. This is for your developer. This is how we request this content from the API. We create it, and then I can add a field. And I get a number of different types of fields here. I have a rich text field available to me. I have text, just a regular plain text field. Rich text is text that has like formatting. So bold, underline, links, that kind of thing. You're going to want that for your blog post itself. You're going to have a number field if you had something like a price. You have date and time fields. You have coordinates, locations. You have media, so images, any kind of file. You have a Boolean field, just like a true or false. JSON object, this is a useful one. Usually we don't give this over to clients too often, but when there are things that are not well represented by the existing fields, or that are just better represented by code, maybe your schema markup could be a good example of this. If you wanted to drop that in here, you can actually just serve raw JSON data in a field. So this is a great escape hatch. And then the reference field is for references to other content types, and we'll get into that in just a moment. So let's start with a blog post. Every blog post needs a title. And we'll set title. We're going to do short text, not long text. Again, this is exact search, full text search. There's search capabilities baked into this. So when it queries, it's querying across all of your fields. You can do things like create a list. If I configure this, I can actually change the appearance of this field. I can make it a single line. I can make it a URL field. So you have to enter a URL field. The slug field is very useful because these do need URLs, right? So we want the slug to be the URL path that we're going to use for this. We'll talk about that next. I can also set a default value for this title. And I can also validate it and make sure that limit character count. I can make it unique so that it can only be that there can only be one title of this type in the whole field. Maybe I want that, right? Maybe I don't want 2 blog posts with the same title. And this will warn my editor if you type the exact same title in 2 fields, it will stop you from doing that. So let's do that. Let's add another field, a small text field. This is going to be your slug, right? We have to use the URL path. Create and configure. You guys saw that in the appearance. We'll throw the slug field up here because this is going to give me a little bit of help here. So it's going to auto type and we'll show you how that works. And then every single blog post has rich text. So this is going to be the body of the post. Let's add that in there, and that'll allow you to do things. And if we take a look at the settings of that field, you can see I've enabled H1, H2, H3, H4, but guess what? My SEO person came to me and said, guess what? You got people putting H1 tags in the middle of the blog post just because it looks cool in the editor. Great, I'm disabling that. You can only do H2 and down because our title is our H1. That can happen. Maybe I don't want links to entries or assets. I only want to allow links to URLs in the editor. Great, I can do that. And maybe I don't want to allow the embedding of different assets, so I can disable that as well. I can say you cannot embed these 2 things. This is how the blog post is configured, and I confirm. These are exactly, if you're a little confused by the things I just said, that's exactly right. These are things that need to be enabled by somebody. For me, when we're building these types of things, if I have a more technical user, I'm going to enable more of this because they're going to understand more of it. If we have a less technical user, I'm going to disable more of it because I don't want them to get into a situation where they can actually break their front end and not understand why. Like embedding an entry into a blog post can only happen if your code is ready to receive that entry. It doesn't happen automatically. In WordPress, it would have, right? So if this type of functionality was enabled in WordPress, it's not. That would have all been handled by the core. But because you have a dev team that's custom tailoring your core code, it's not really ready to take an entry that needs to render as a component. Let's imagine in the middle of an article, I wanted to add some kind of an advertisement entry that I was creating. Your code has to be ready to receive that, or it just won't show up. So if you do this yourself and you go, why isn't it working? Well, the reason it's not working is because your development team did not enable it for you yet in the code base. And that can have different consequences and different trade-offs. So you need to talk to them about that before you do it. Now let's go ahead and save this. Now we have a blog post, simple blog post, but you know what? I want an author. And an author, I don't want to have to retype the name every single time. So now we get into the situation where we're going to add a new content type. A model, content model. Let's add authors. Let's create an author. Let's add a field. Text. It has a first name. Create. Let's make an author have a last name. Maybe the authors are going to have pages. What do we think? Should the maybe you know what? We don't have, that's not a requirement today. Authors aren't going to have their own pages, so we don't need to worry about a URL path for them. We don't even need to worry about a description for them, but we do want to have a picture. So we'll just do like a photo for them. And you know what? I don't want to call it photo. I want to call it profile. I like that better. Could call it anything I want. I can name these fields anything I want. These models are infinitely flexible. If I want this author field to grow, to have a slug and a description and a URL path, I can do that in the future. But again, as a principle of engineering, it's probably best not to build things before they're actually needed, because your requirements might change by the time you go to implement it. So we don't just enable every single possibility under the sun, because your requirements are going to change by the time you go to implement that. And so we want to make sure that we take the requirements at the time that you want to build it and then bake it into the CMS incrementally over time. And once it's built, you have it forever. So you decided you wanted to add authors. We're going to add a reference, and this is going to be the author. Do blog posts have 1 or 2 authors? That's a question. If we do 1 reference, we only get 1. But we could do many references, we'll do many. Let's enable many, because there might be a blog that has an author and a co-author, 2 or 3 authors. Maybe this is a science blog or something. So let's create that. We went back to the content team and they said we need to serve as many authors. Great. Now you have 2 content models. When you come back over to your content here, you have nothing. But it's going to say, do you want to add a blog post or an author? Well, I'll add myself to here. Mike Rispoli, and I'll add a profile photo, add new media. We can open a file selector. We can select some files. I have a whole bunch of stuff in here, but let's see if I can find a decent profile photo. Where? Oh, of course, Dropbox has moved its move things. Let me just go into my downloads and I'll just pick something out of here.
I'll cut all this out.
Yeah, I don't have a good photo. I unfortunately don't have a great photo. You can cut all this for me. Yeah.
I know where there is one. Go to our Google Drive. Go to Coke Assets. Go to
yeah. Yeah. Let me go in here. I think I have it. Oh, here it is. Pictures. Profile photos. There's my profile photo. Let me just throw my standard one. Yilcha. So we added the profile photo. It just took the title, description. This is going to be your alt text. It should be. If you're working with the dev team, make sure they tell them that they want alt text on all the images, and the alt text should be filled in, and it comes from the description on the image. This is how I like to set things up, but there's nothing about Contentful that says that that's going to happen. Your developer has to do that for you. You have to be ahead of that. So for me, I tell all of our clients, fill in the description. This is going to be the alt text. This is your accessibility scores. So I'm going to say Mike Rispoli profile photo. This should describe what's in the image. Publish or not. This is now another aspect of these. Right now we have nothing, but I can publish this so that it's all ready to go. But if you are working in draft mode or something like that, you don't have to publish. When I'm developing locally, I don't publish anything until we're ready. So the other cool thing about Contentful, though, is I actually have like scheduled publishing. I can also archive things. So I can actually set this to publish on a specific date, which will trigger the rebuild of my website. So when someone says, hey, I want this blog post to go live at this time and this date, I go ahead and I set a schedule on it. But for this, it's just an author. So I'm just going to publish it. And let's create our first blog post. And again, the title of the blog post is going to be my first post. It actually auto-fills in the slug for me. And then I can, lorem ipsum, the usual ... We talked about these embeds. I was only allowing assets to be embedded. And then when I add the author, I'm going to add existing content. It's going to show me blog post and authors. This is interesting now. Well, we know we only want an author, but as the developer here, I've realized something. I've not put a guardrail on this. I've allowed you to enter more than just an author in the author field. Let's just hop back to our content model, go back over to the blog post, go to this, settings, validation, accept only a specific entry type, author. Boom. And I can also type a custom error message. You must enter an author in this field. I can also say this is required. Save it. Come back over to our content. Now, when I go back to my blog post and I go and add an existing entry, the only thing that shows are authors. I can't add anything else. And these are the kinds of guardrails you want to put into place and the things you want to look at when you go to build out a CMS for somebody. We can add locales here. It also tells me when these assets are linked. So another cool thing to look at is when we jump into our author here, it's going to show me that this is linked to my first blog post. So I know that whenever I change this, I'm also potentially changing the data downstream for my first post. So it's important to understand this sidebar and to look. You can see that there's multiple versions. It's letting me go back in time to see the changes over time to these different posts. These are all things that a lot of your more traditional CMSs don't have. So it also gives us a little more ability to investigate and dig into things. You even have a comment section. We can talk about this. If this is a blog, if we go back to the blog post and we want to get it approved by somebody, first we can put a comment in here and we can chat about it, make edits together. And then I can set this to schedule. I could say, I want this to publish on the 14th at 12 a.m. Time zone, New York. Set it. It's scheduled to publish now. Ready to go. So this will be viewable in my drafts or my previews. But now you've begun to see exactly how a headless CMS begins to come together here. This is a very flexible platform. You get a really nice UI around all of these things, but there's nothing in it doesn't do anything inherently until I begin to allow it to do that. Let's say I wanted to have blog posts in a preview state. I only wanted to show like the first 450 characters of the blog post. The CMS doesn't do that for me. As a developer, I have to architect that for you. I might come back and say, okay, I can do that. I'm going to go to the blog post. I'm going to add a field. I'm going to add a Boolean. I'm going to call it coming soon. And I'm going to create and configure it. and the default value is going to be no. It's not always coming soon. This is just the feature that we want to use. I add that in there, and now I can go ahead and come over to my content as the editor. I tell you as the editor, come in here and say coming soon. Yes. That enables this, but that feature that I just described, it'll only show 450 characters, that has to be enabled by your developer in the code side. Contentful doesn't do that for you, but it gives me the ability to add custom fields and flags and different things that I can build features on top of and allow people to have control of. And in the traditional CMS system, we wouldn't have been able to do that. We would have done this under the hood. Or maybe you had to call your developer directly to enable that for a specific type of thing. But now we can make these things talk together. And I can actually trigger an event. Let's say I publish this. It can send an event to another system. Maybe it's Shopify, and letting Shopify know that this feature is in this state. Or it can parse Shopify off. It can say, don't fetch Shopify in this situation. We don't need all that data because this is just a teaser. All of these things are enabled by your development team. They don't inherently come with the CMS. So it's important to remember that you have a ton of flexibility here. But every feature needs to be built, and every feature should be pointy. Try to avoid really broad features. Try and avoid covering too many edge cases, because that's where you can start to get into trouble, because it's not necessarily apparent to the user of the CMS.
Hey, I'm Mike. I'm the CTO of Cause of a Kind. We're an award-winning agency based out of New York, and we build a lot of software here. If you're enjoying these videos about headless CMSs and demystifying the technology that's running your business, like and subscribe.